Good morning, everyone. It's an honour to be able to present to you today, and I thank you for the opportunity. Since my dear grandfather, Peter Sedgman, or Perez Szechtman, or as I will often refer to him, Grandpa, died just over 2 years ago, I've followed a path I never in my wildest dreams expected to find. Being somewhere of significance to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Aktion Erntefest has been one of my ambitions ever since, and I'd like to convey my special thanks to the Fondation Auschwitz for hosting this special conference, thereby allowing this to happen. I have some understanding of the academic world, but today I present from a human perspective based on my own real-life experiences. I don't think my presentation will serve to address any profound philosophical questions, but from a historical perspective, the facts are compelling, and how everything that follows was validated is a story in its own right. I look forward to also mentioning some anecdotes along the way which add some real flavour to the journey. While listening to yesterday's lectures, it occurred to me that the events of the 3rd and 4th of November 1943, which constitute Aktion Erntefest, have not yet been explicitly mentioned. For the record, allow me to just spend a couple of minutes summarising. By the autumn of 1943, in the wake of uprisings at Warsaw, Treblinka and Sobibor, it became apparent to Himmler that it would no longer be possible to complete one of the final stages of Aktion Reinhardt by liquidating the Lublin ghetto gradually. There was no choice to him but to eliminate the remaining Jews of Lublin in a single mass killing. In late October, Jewish prisoners were tasked with digging trenches just outside of Majdanek, Poniatowa and Trawniki camps. SS police units were soon mobilised, and on the evenings of the 2nd of November, Globocnik's recent successor, Jakob Sporenberg, met with commanders of various forces, and instructions were given to carry out the mass killing operation the next day. Early the following morning, all remaining Jews in Lublin were marched to Majdanek, where over the course of the day, all were systematically shot. The sounds of gunfire were attempted to be masked by music blaring from loudspeakers. On the same day, and by the same method, all Jewish prisoners at the nearby Trawniki camp were massacred. Still alive were some 14,000 Jews at Poniatowa. However, on the following day, the 4th of November, with the same lack of forewarning, all there were similarly murdered. In all, over these 2 days, it's estimated that between 38 and 42,000 Jews were shot dead in what was the largest single day's mass murder of Jews. An estimated 18,000 Jews died at Majdanek alone that day. For a comprehensive account of Aktion Erntefest, amongst the other sources that have been mentioned this weekend, may I recommend Robert Browning's famous book, Ordinary Men. Back to my grandfather. I'd like to start this with a story when my brother Rod and I were young kids. The highlight of each week was Saturday night when our parents went out and we looked forward to our mother's father, Peter, babysitting us. Our grandfather was always a hero to us. The best part of the night was him telling us fabulous stories of his amazing life. Of course, none of them were true, and we knew it. But in our eyes, it didn't matter. We loved them and we played along with the game. But interspersed with his stories were many snippets of life in Lublin as a youngster, and also some references to his war experiences. As we got older, the full details of his own most incredible true story began to emerge. His epic tale of survival through the dark years of the war gradually became more evident. But it's only now after his passing that we are realising the extent of his experiences and how significant they are in the larger historical context. So by the mid-1980s, my grandfather was incredibly open and took any opportunity to talk about his Holocaust story. We're lucky that we have his testimony recorded in multiple archives. In 1995, my grandfather's testimony was recorded as part of the Spielberg project. This was a springboard to a longer project conducted by the Sydney Jewish Museum to have survivors write their autobiographies. And in 2006, his autobiography, As Far As I Can Remember, was published. With my mother Christine's permission and with the wonderful typesetters Frederick has arranged, you all have received a copy which you're welcome to read in your own time. Furthermore, I conducted my own taped interviews over many hours as one extra measure that his account would be preserved. I would, however, like to first give you an idea of what it was like growing up in a post-Holocaust Jewish family in Sydney. For so many Jewish kids of my age growing up in Sydney in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, it was incredibly rare not to have some direct connection with at least one survivor of the Holocaust. Between 1946 and 1954, Australia took in over 17,000 Jews from Europe, the vast majority being Holocaust survivors, and most of these settled in Sydney and Melbourne. On top of this, another 8,000 Jews were absorbed from pre-war Austria, many of whom had already experienced camps such as Dachau in the late 1930s. The Jewish communities in these cities were tight-knit, and the reality was that it was a rare exception that a family had not been severely affected by the Holocaust. Most of my friends were Jewish, and so it was just a fact of life that it seemed that every old person had gone through one of these concentration camps. We grew up knowing about the atrocities without really thinking too deeply about them, just accepting that they had happened. Allow me to use my own family tree as an example. I was born in Sydney in 1968. My father was the son of a Viennese couple who emigrated in March 1939, and my father was born in Sydney in 1941. My mother's parents were Jews from Lublin. My mother was born in 1946 in a displaced persons camp in Italy. Jens already touched upon this. They came to Australia in 1949. I'll explain more later, but it turned out there was a need for my mother to have a set of foster parents in Sydney. A lovely couple, Margaret and Charles Rice from Czechoslovakia, who I was lucky to consider as an extra set of grandparents. So my family tree was like this. They did have faces. But to my point of how so many of our families were exposed to the Holocaust experience, I'd like to take a look at this tree from a regrettably sad perspective. Let's take a moment to absorb that. It's a concentration camp family tree. My father's father, Emil, was interned in Dachau, that's on the far left, was interned in Dachau in 1938. My mum's foster parents, down the bottom, Margaret and Charles, were survivors of Theresienstadt and Auschwitz. And my mother's father, the main subject of this talk, experienced and survived Majdanek. And this is how so many of our close family, friends, families would have looked. But important to realise are the many missing boxes on this tree, all those who didn't make it out of the ghettos and camps. So you can see how the names of Dachau, Theresienstadt, Majdanek and Auschwitz were etched into my mind at a very young age. I knew my grandparents suffered immensely, experiencing more death and terror than I could ever imagine. And I saw the numbers tattooed on the arms of Margaret and Charles. They were not the only ones. The sight of them playing canasta with friends all displaying their tattoos was not uncommon. But because so many around me had similar experiences, I somehow felt this was just a fact of life. And so it was with my grandfather's tale. None of us ever questioned that this was any more special compared to any other Holocaust survivor. For in order to survive the Shoah, it was necessary to have a unique story. It personally meant a huge amount to us, but we had, It personally meant a huge deal to us, but we had no inkling that he was witness to anything more significant than thousands of other survivors, all of whom experienced atrocities we can only imagine. So let me give you a brief background of my grandfather, Peter Sedgman. Born Perez Szechtman on the 17th of November 1917 in Lublin, Poland, he was the third of 4 siblings in a typically traditional Yiddish family. From an early age, he remembered the strong Zionist beliefs of his parents, and it was always the aim for his father to move to Palestine. After years of putting aside money from the family haberdashery business, in 1936, his father finally made the journey to Israel, followed by Peter a year later. However, Peter and his father found it difficult to settle in, and by 1939, Peter was back in Lublin. But no matter how difficult life in Palestine had proved, it was going to be nothing compared to the enormous challenges to be faced over the next 5 years. After enlisting in the Polish army in 1939, he served 2 whole days before he was captured by the Germans after the invasion of Poland that September. He was immediately sent to Stalag 2B, prisoner of war camp in Hammerstein, Germany, where he was interned for the next year, but interned as a Polish war prisoner, not as a Jew. By late 1940, he was released and found his way back to Lublin, where although there was still a certain degree of freedom for the Jews of Lublin, semblances of a controlled existence under the Nazis were definitely in play. My grandfather writes that by the summer of 1941, transports of Jews from Holland, Germany and Czechoslovakia were all dumped in Lublin. The Jewish population swelled to about 200,000. It's clear that early on, Peter showed the guile which was required for survival. Despite the fact that the Jews of Lublin were increasingly being rounded into the ghetto, Peter and his family managed to still live quite comfortably, in his own words. This was due to his ability to somehow source papers which showed he was employed by the mounted police. He states that it was this piece of paper which helped save him and his family until the point when Lublin was finally declared Judenrein. It was not long before it was obvious that the end was nearing. Within months, the liquidation of the Jews in Lublin district had commenced. He writes that non-stop selections all happened around Easter 1942. He writes of, a quote, the pain and horror imprinted on his mother's face, devastated knowing how little was left. Furthermore, they were perfectly aware what was happening to all the transported Jews from Lublin. It was clear the destination was the death camps. And I should add, he usually referred to the camp of Belgium in particular. Peter and his family were soon resettled with almost all other remaining Jews from the Lublin ghetto to the nearby suburb of Majdanek. Life here for Peter and his family turned significantly for the worse. The houses were all extremely overcrowded. In Peter's house alone, 12 people slept in the attic. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and was controlled by the Judenrat and the Jewish police. They had full control over the dwindling Jewish population and sometimes treated them worse than the Germans. In late 1942, Gestapo officers ordered all Jews from houses to come out for identification and inspection. All of Peter's family were present, except for his older brother Tzadok, who remained in hiding in their house. When Peter showed his family's identification papers, they were torn in front of his eyes, and Peter, his family, and dozens of other Jews were marched in the direction of Majdanek concentration camps. This is in 1942. Peter realised death was near and miraculously escaped back to his house, where he found his brother Tzadok still in hiding. The joy of being reunited with his brother was short-lived, as it was not long before he learnt that all the others in this group, including his family, were machine-gunned to death by Einsatzgruppen in a nearby forest. This had a huge impact on Peter's brother Tzadok, and he himself soon lost the will to live. My grandfather constantly used to describe how from this point it became not just a battle of survival from the Nazis, but also a constant struggle to keep his brother's morale up. Peter and his brother had been moved back to another prisoner of war camp known as Lipova 7, previously a football field located in central Lublin. They escaped Lipova 7 in November 1942, and for the next 6 months hid with an old Gentile customer by the name of Mrs. Marcinczak and her son Genyek. My grandfather spoke until his dying days with great admiration and appreciation of these two. And he was forever in no doubt that without their selfless acts of bravery, it is unlikely that the two of them would have survived this time. Mrs. Marcinczak and her son remain to be officially recognised as righteous amongst the nations at Yad Vashem, but there's no doubt they're worthy to be included. It's indeed one of my goals to ensure this is the case. By Easter 1943, the time came to move on from Mrs. Marcinczak's. At this point, it was Peter's preference to join the partisans. However, his brother Tzadok had now reached desperation point and soon broke down, attempting to take his own life. My grandfather wrote, he wanted to turn himself over to the Germans and felt he was only a burden to me. Nevertheless, my grandfather managed to settle him and a decision was made to return to the Lipova 7 camp. I'd like to take a moment describing the emotion which Peter, my grandfather, spoke of this difficult period with his brother. I recall only a couple of specific incidents which elicited such a tearful emotion from him, namely this and an incident in 1942 when his sister's young boy died in tragic circumstances, not at the hands of the Nazis, but in an accident at home when a burning kettle accidentally fell into the sleeping baby's cot. One can imagine only in such terribly cramped conditions could such a tragedy occur. But his constant tearful reaction to these two events was significant. I always wondered why, for a man who experienced so much death and terror, did these invoke such emotion. My own theory is that these were both incidents that may have been able to be avoided, and perhaps he felt unreasonably that he had some control over the situation. So it was that Peter and his brother returned to Lipova 7, and it was there that their oppressed lives continued until the fateful day of the 3rd of November 1943. Early on that morning, the prisoners were woken by sirens and taken to the inspection. At first, all seemed normal, but it soon became apparent that the guards were more heavily armed, and within a short time, every Jew was marched in procession towards Majdanek, a large concentration camp only a few kilometres away from the centre of Lublin. Aktion Erntefest was upon them. I've described briefly the events of that and the next day, 3rd and 4th of November 1943, and Jens has just provided an excellent account of the subsequent forced labour of exhuming mass graves in the Borek forest as part of Sonderaktion 2005. There are obviously only a handful of witness testimonies in existence, and now we know that we may add my grandfather's statements as evidence. I would like to add, however, that my grandfather's account is consistent with these others. And he recounts in his Spielberg testimony how he managed to avoid being shot on that day, since he was one of only 61 men selected from the 5th Field on the basis of their strength and physique. The Nazi officer in charge explained to them that they were the only remaining Jews in Europe, and how they had been selected to, I quote, create a new race of Jew. But first they were tasked with the exhumation of the thousands of bodies from the Chelm forest, now known to be the Borek forest, through the research of Jens and others. But in all of his testimonies, my grandfather never ever mentioned the words Aktion Erntefest, nor did he know, neither did he mention the Borek forest by name. As his grandson, I, like so many others, had never even heard of this event or this place. For all the times I listened to the story of the murders that took place that day, as well as his miraculous escape from the forest, it never occurred to me that I might find others who were even aware of this event, let alone find descendants of the handful of other survivors. I'd like to now jump to June 2016. My grandfather, now aged 98, in perfect mental health, but with a slowing body, had been admitted to hospital. Until that time, he was in the strongest of health, but now for the first time, it was clear that finally his time might be approaching. I took it upon myself to take one more set of interviews in the hospital ward. This time, however, I armed myself with an iPad, and as he was talking, constantly Googled some of the names and places he mentioned, in the remote hope of finding some other reference. In particular, I'd done some research the previous night, and for the first time in my life had come across the phrase Aktion Erntefest. I took the opportunity to question if in fact it was this event that my grandfather had survived. When my grandfather got to late October 1943 in the interview, I began to question him thoroughly, now armed with this new background information. Every fact tied up so closely with what I'd found on the internet. We'll have a bit of a listen at this point. Please excuse some hospital noises. When 20,000 people were killed,
liquidation Lublin ghetto, liquidation Lublin U9. That's it.
Judenfrei.
Lublin U9. They took together all the single men, few men, for the work of certain places for the Germans. They put them on the 5th floor, on the 5th field in the Majdanek, in Majdanek, Majdanek concentration camp, and they were prepared graves already in machine guns, but the sound of music, they killed them. And after
they put music on.
The music was on and the machine guns were playing. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
We could hear the music because we were on the 5th field.
Could you hear the music?
Of course. We were on the 5th field.
He was still pretty sharp. You can get a feeling for the kind of animated character he was. So you can hear that just in that short passage there, every detail was consistent. From the approximate number of people shot, to the description of music playing loudly to mask the shooting, to the identification of the 5th field from where prisoners were taken to their execution. However, my grandfather was insistent that this mass shooting at Majdanek took place in October 1943, not November, as has been well documented. In these interviews, I questioned him 3 or 4 times over these interviews, wondering if he could possibly have the date wrong, but he was insistent. And I'll just play you one little bit more. But I was researching it, and I'm sure what's written there, it's I swear to God, word for word what you're saying. But the date they've got is November 43.
No. November people were already in the forest working. In October, we might stop 2-3 days, not that they come the trucks.
So due to this date discrepancy, I left the hospital that day, uncertain if in fact my grandfather had experienced Erntefest. As things turned out, my grandfather then moved to an aged care home in reasonable health, but with the reality that he was significantly slowing down physically. Always in good spirits, he finally passed away a few months later, in September 2016. But since leaving hospital that day, I hadn't given much more thought to trying to fact-check my grandfather's testimony and basically let sleeping dogs lie, not giving it too much more thought. Until my grandfather passed away quietly on the 23rd of September 2016, and my brother and I immediately started writing his eulogy. My brother Rod took care of Peter's life in post-war Australia, while I penned his childhood and wartime experiences. I scoured my grandfather's autobiography, trying to find any missing details, and made one final attempt to see if there was anything on the internet which might correspond with his story. It was time to see once and for all if he had in fact witnessed this Aktion Erntefest. Suddenly a line in his autobiography jumped out at me. One morning in early November, we were woken by sirens in the camp. There it was in black and white, staring at me in the face. It was November all along, not October, and there was now no doubt in my mind. In the book, my grandfather mentions two fellow escapees who survived both the mass shooting and also the imprisonment in the forest when they were tasked with exhuming the mass graves of the murdered Russian soldiers. These two men were named in the book as Reznik and Szechtman, and so I started furiously punching every possible combination of spelling of these names into Google. I'm not joking when I say it was 1 a.m. when I typed some strange version of each of these names spelling, and it gives me goosebumps now when I tell you how out of the screen popped the following quote. And there it was, in front of my eyes. This quote about some chap, Jens Hoffmann. I'll just read it. A few years later, Jens took over. The reports had left him no peace. He organised the translations and recorded the searches for the witnesses. He came too late for direct contact with the survivors. Lipman Aronovich, Josef Reznik, Josef Szechtman, and Leon Eliezer Mandel were already dead. The whereabouts of Edward Gleich and a sixth survivor, Perez Szechtman, or maybe Szechter, remained completely unclear. There was no doubt about it. Together with the names of Reznik and Szechtman was my grandfather's name. This guy, Jens Hoffmann, had apparently done some pretty big research into the topic. But who was Jens Hoffmann, and how did he know about my grandfather? I had to find him, but how would I break this news that in fact Perez Szechtman had well and truly survived the war, but it was now, a mere day after his death, that I was reaching out to him. I remained very sad for both Jens, whoever he was, we now know only too well, and my grandfather, that this discovery was not made only a few days earlier. I immediately sent emails to the author of the various web pages and waited with bated breath for any reply. In the meantime, I set out to find more about these other survivors, Reznik and Szechtman in particular. It was not long before I made another incredible discovery. Not only did Josef Reznik survive, but he ended up testifying at the Eichmann trial in 1961. I must admit that when I used to listen to the details of how my grandfather and the other 60 prisoners in the Borek forest planned and executed their escape, it always seemed just a bit too incredible to be true. Something like something out of a movie. I always felt the need of other validation just in case there was a chance that somehow the effects of time might have embellished his version of this episode. Suddenly there it was on my computer screen, Reznik's account of life and escape in the Borek forest, as well as the events in Majdanek, almost word for word matching my grandfather's testimony. From being a prisoner in Lipova 7 to events in the 5th Field at Majdanek on the 3rd of November 1943, to the exhumation of thousands of bodies in mass graves buried in the Chelm forest, to the mass tunnel escape of the 60 or so prisoners in February 1944. All the facts lined up with my grandfather's account. When asked by the presiding judge at the Eichmann trial what happened to the other survivors, Reznik replied, "The others, 4 people, saved themselves together with me. 2 others are here in Israel and 1 is in America." I can only assume that Reznik thought my grandfather had made it to America rather than Australia after the war. It was not long before I made contact with Jens and Skype conversations started. The most pressing question I had was how was it that he had heard of my grandfather, Perez Szechtman? My grandfather had always mentioned that he had appeared before a Russian commission to investigate war crimes by the Nazis immediately after the liberation of Lublin. But never did I think that records of this could possibly still exist. Jens explained that in his research, he was led to Lublin, where in fact these court records are still intact. With respect to the activity of the Nazis in the Borek forest, he found a record that my grandfather had actually provided a testimony, but he was not able to find the testimony itself. It was this research that led him also to the names of the other few survivors. Learning this information only days after my grandfather's passing was obviously emotional. If only he knew that those other co-survivors had gone on to live fruitful lives in Israel, I know he would have been overjoyed at the news, and it saddened me he could not see this for his own eyes. Nevertheless, I was overjoyed with the discovery, and also to learn that Jens had tracked descendants of the other survivors of Erntefest and the escape from the forest. Although Josef Sterdner, Josef Resnick, and a third survivor have since passed away, the children and grandchildren of each of them are all doing well in Israel. With the help of Jens, I was able to contact these families, and last July I was in Israel and finally got to meet Josef Resnick's son, Zaki, or Jacob. There's a photo of him with his grandson. This was a wonderful experience. I gave him a copy of my grandfather's autobiography, showing him specific mention of his father. He was astounded to see this, but his emotion was saved for a particular moment which I'd like to share. Like my grandfather with us, Josef Resnick always told Zaki his very similar story, but there was always one nagging question that Zaki could never understand, and that was how was it after their escape from the Borek forest camp did they manage to free themselves from the steel shackles which bound their feet? He simply could never understand this, and the question always plagued him. My grandfather's testimony provided the answer explicitly. Amongst the machinery used to dispose of the thousands of bodies in the mass graves was a bone crusher, and the man who operated this machine used his tools, and maybe in fact that machine itself, to cut the chains. When Zaki learnt of this relatively minor fact, he was moved to tears. In much the same way that I felt my grandfather's story was finally validated, I can only assume that at this news he felt similarly so. It was a real pleasure to meet Zaki, and we remain in touch. Last December, my son Oliver was in Israel and also got to spend a week at the Sterdner family, who hosted him very generously. I sincerely hope we get to see each other very soon and remain in touch. I certainly look forward to returning the hospitality. Unlike all of you here, I'm in no way a historian, but I have a great sense of logic and proof, and I felt that all of these aspects were important in my mind to ensure that the testimony of my grandfather could now be used effectively to help ensure that these horrific episodes be more accurately recorded and substantiated. I'm still amazed how few people, Jewish or otherwise, have even heard of these specific events. And that's very much been a theme of this conference. My own theory for this is that there were simply so few survivors who were actually able to provide a first-hand testimony. There are simply no artefacts, and the only evidence is the fact that there is no evidence. This seems to be very consistent with the themes that have been presented so far this weekend. On a historical basis, I found all of these developments personally very beneficial for three reasons. Firstly, it enabled me to piece together some aspects of my grandfather's story and the story in general, which was still unclear. Secondly, there was now extra validation that what my grandfather had been telling us for years was factually accurate. And finally, we were now able to cross-reference his story with a handful of other first-hand testimonies. I'm just so pleased that I can be here now, 75 years to the day, to provide this evidence in such an important forum. I'd just like to spend a few minutes, I think we've still got time, just to talk about his life after the war. Although not specifically relevant to the topic of this conference, I'd just like to give you a short summary of Peter's life after the war. If nothing else, it's an example of a route taken by so many of the souls who were so lost and how lives were rebuilt. A short time after returning to Lublin, my grandfather met and fell in love with Stella Cohen, a beautiful young lady from Lublin. Although Jewish, she looked, as my grandfather said, like a real shiksa. Her non-Jewish appearance allowed her to obtain false papers, which was how she survived the war. They felt Lublin, indeed Poland, was no place for them. They were shocked by comments such as, "The Jews reappear like mushrooms in the rain." And so, on the 3rd of May 1945, they married in Lublin and made immediate plans to leave. It was through the work of the Jewish American Relief Organisation, known as the Joint, that led them to one of the well-known displaced persons camps at Santa Maria al Bagno in the very south of Italy. And it was here that my mother was born. That's my grandfather Peter with my grandmother Stella. Nice photo. Reflects, I think, the happiness of the time. And it was here my mother was born in 1946. The family's time in Italy was always fondly remembered, but it was temporary, and in 1949 the family of 3 sailed to Sydney, Australia. New problems, however, soon arose in this wondrous new world. Within months, my grandmother Stella was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And sadly soon she became bedridden. It was not long before she went into permanent hospital care in early 1952, soon never to walk again. By that time, my grandfather had established himself as a travelling salesman with the need to be on the road for weeks at a time. It was difficult to find the means to care for my mother, and in 1953, Mum was placed in a Jewish orphanage in Sydney. This was not an entirely unhappy time for her. She was one of about 30 Jewish kids who were in a similar situation in the shadow of the war, and so there was some great company, but it wasn't like a home as most of us know. It did also result in the fortune of being fostered out to the most loving couple, Margaret and Charles Rice, themselves survivors of Auschwitz. They treated and spoiled Mum in every way as though she was their own, and my brother and I grew up being adored by them as true grandparents. Very sadly, my grandmother Stella lived out her days in hospital care, dying in 1975, a week shy of her 50th birthday. It's fair to say that ultimately my grandfather lived a very happy, full and healthy life until he passed away in 2016. His legacy is tremendous, and despite the hardship he faced, he very rarely had a bad word to say about anyone. He had a sharp sense of humour, photographic memory, loved sport, especially football and tennis, and absolutely adored his daughter Christine and our whole family. This photo from a few years ago, with my son Ollie on the right and my nephew Max in the middle. It's my hope that his story and testimony may be used as evidence to guarantee that the terrible events he endured and which claimed the lives of tens of thousands of others during the war are never forgotten. I acknowledge you for all the incredible work and research you all do to ensure this will be the case, and I'd like to express my gratitude. Thank you very much.